The sun was a bully that afternoon, pressing down on the concrete canyons of the city with a hot, heavy hand. On a specific corner, right outside the gleaming chrome and red vinyl of a classic diner, the heat shimmered up from the pavement, making the air dance. It was on this patch of sizzling sidewalk that a man had made his small world. He was an older man, shaped a bit like a question mark from years of leaning into the wind, with a face that was a road map of hard miles and quiet sorrows. His clothes were worn soft, not from fashion but from function, and his few earthly possessions were tucked into a worn backpack beside him. But he wasn't alone. Curled up on his lap, using the man's thigh as a pillow, was a small dog. The dog was a patchwork of beige and white fur, with one ear that flopped forward and another that stood at attention as if it couldn't make up its mind. Its tail gave a slow, lazy thump-thump-thump against the man's leg every time he stroked its head. Their bond was a quiet, unspoken thing, a bubble of peace in the middle of the city's chaos. The man's gnarled, calloused fingers moved gently through the dog's scruffy coat, a repetitive, soothing motion that seemed to calm them both. For them, the roar of the buses, the impatient honk of car horns, and the chatter of passing pedestrians were just background noise to their silent, steadfast companionship. This fragile peace was shattered by a sound that started deep in the city's bones and grew into a deafening roar. It was the rumble of motorcycles, not the quiet purr of a commuter bike, but the aggressive, thunderous growl of machines built for power and intimidation. One by one, they peeled around the corner, a pack of dark metal and gleaming chrome. They were huge, muscular bikes that seemed to snarl even when they were just idling. They pulled up to the curb in a sharp, disobedient line, blocking a fire hydrant and half the sidewalk. The riders were just as imposing as their machines. They were clad in black leather and denim, their arms adorned with tattoos that told stories the world might never hear. The leader, a mountain of a man with a thick, black beard that was braided into 2 points, swung his leg over his ride with a heavy thud of his boot on the pavement. He was the one they all looked to, the epicenter of their little storm. His name was Rocco, and he carried himself like a king who owned every piece of ground he stepped on. Rocco's eyes, small and dark, scanned the street, looking for something to break the monotony of the day. They passed over the diner, the cars, the pedestrians, and then locked onto the still figure of the old man and his dog. A slow, cruel smile spread across Rocco's face, a predator that had just spotted its weakest prey. He nudged one of his buddies, a skinny man with a long, greasy ponytail, and nodded in the direction of the corner. The whole group turned to look, and a ripple of low laughter passed through them. Rocco began to walk towards the old man, his heavy boots crunching on the gritty sidewalk. His gang fell into step behind him, a moving wall of leather and ink, cutting off any easy escape. The old man, whose name was Arthur, felt the shadow fall over him before he even looked up. He flinched, pulling his dog, Buddy, a little closer. His body tensed, and he tried to make himself smaller, to become invisible, but it was no use. "Well, well, well," Rocco's voice boomed, loud and mocking, designed for an audience. "Look what we have here, boys." It's the king of the corner and his royal jester. He pointed a thick finger at Buddy, who whimpered softly and tucked his tail tightly against his body, pressing his face into Arthur's side. The bikers laughed again, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped at the air. Arthur didn't say anything. He just kept his head down, his hand resting protectively on Buddy's back, hoping that if he didn't engage, they would just get bored and move on. But Rocco was just getting started. He crouched down, bringing his face level with Arthur's, the smell of leather and stale cigarettes filling the space between them. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old-timer," Rocco snarled, his playful tone dropping into something more menacing. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just saving all your good conversation for the mutt?" Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He could feel the tremor running through Buddy's small body. He had seen men like this before, men who fed on the fear of others. He knew that showing fear only made them hungrier. He took a slow, shaky breath and finally risked a glance up. Rocco's eyes were cold, devoid of any empathy. They were just enjoying the show, the power he held. He's a good dog, Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper, dry and cracked from disuse. He doesn't bother anyone. This only seemed to amuse Rocco more. He stood back up to his full, intimidating height and puffed out his chest, looking back at his crew for approval. A good dog, he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in mock surprise. He doesn't bother anyone. That's great, Grandpa, really. But I gotta ask, is that it? Is this mangy little rug with a heartbeat all you have in the world? The question hung in the hot, thick air, sharper and more painful than a physical blow. It was a question designed to strip a man of his last shred of dignity. A few people on the sidewalk stopped to watch, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They gave the group a wide berth, pulling out their phones not to help, but to record the spectacle from a safe distance. Rocco, not satisfied with the old man's silent suffering, decided to escalate. He wanted a bigger reaction, a more satisfying display of power. He took another step forward, his boot now just inches from Arthur's worn-out shoe. He looked down at Buddy, who was shivering uncontrollably now. "Look at this stupid thing," Rocco sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He crouched down again, this time getting right in the dog's face. He snapped his fingers loudly, right in front of Buddy's nose. "Hey, stupid! You understand me? You're just a worthless stray, aren't you? Just like your owner." Buddy let out a high-pitched whine of pure terror and tried to burrow completely into Arthur's lap. This was too much for Arthur. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but a wave of something stronger rose up in him, a fierce, protective love for the one creature in the world who had never left his side. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them torture his friend. "Please, sir," Arthur said, his voice trembling but clear. "Just leave us be, please." The plea, so quiet and filled with desperation, seemed to pull the plug on Rocco's performance. The mocking smile vanished from his face, replaced by a dark cloud of anger. He stood up slowly, his massive frame blocking out the sun and casting Arthur and Buddy into a cold shadow. He loomed over the old man, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The playful cruelty was gone, and now there was only the threat of real violence. The laughter from the other bikers died down and the air grew heavy and tense. The whole corner seemed to hold its breath. Rocco leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was far more terrifying than his shouting had been. "Or what, Grandpa?" he asked, his words a chilling promise of pain. "What are you going to do about it?" The plea hung in the air, a tiny, fragile thing in the face of so much aggression. For a moment, there was a silence so complete that Arthur could hear the frantic, thumping beat of his own heart, a drum solo of pure terror. He could feel the fine tremor running through Buddy's small body, a vibration of fear that mirrored his own. He had done it. He had spoken up. And now, he was certain, he was going to pay the price. Rocco's face, which had been a mask of cruel amusement, went completely still. The smile vanished, and in its place was a chilling blankness. It was like watching a television screen being switched off, leaving nothing but a cold, dark void. The change was more terrifying than the shouting had been. Slowly, deliberately, Rocco pushed himself up from his crouch. His knees cracked, a loud, ugly sound in the quiet. He rose to his full, intimidating height, and his shadow grew until it completely swallowed Arthur and Buddy, plunging them into a sudden, cold darkness. The sun, which had been beating down so relentlessly, now felt 1,000,000 miles away. The world shrank to this small, dark space on the sidewalk. Rocco's hands, which had been dangling loosely at his sides, now clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white. The veins on his thick forearms stood out like cords. He was no longer playing. This was not a performance for his friends anymore. This was personal. The other bikers seemed to sense the shift in the mood. Their smirks faded, replaced by a look of keen, almost hungry anticipation. They moved in closer, not saying anything, but their presence created a wall of black leather and silent menace. There was no way out. To Arthur's left was the solid brick wall of the diner, cold and unyielding against his back. To his right, the pack of bikers blocked any escape to the street. In front of him was Rocco, a mountain of barely contained rage. He was trapped. Buddy let out another soft whine, a sound of pure despair. and tried to press himself so deeply into Arthur's lap that he might disappear. Rocco leaned in, bringing his face so close to Arthur's that the old man could smell the stale coffee on his breath and the faint, greasy scent of whatever he'd eaten for lunch. His voice was no longer a loud boom. It was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated in the air, a sound that seemed to shake Arthur's very bones. "Or what, Grandpa?" he asked, the words a chilling promise of pain. "What are you going to do about it?" Each word was carefully chosen, sharpened, and thrown like a dart. The question wasn't really a question. It was a statement. It said, "Asterisk, you are powerless. You are nothing. I can do whatever I want, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Asterisk. Arthur's mind raced, searching for an answer, a magic word that could defuse the bomb ticking in front of him. But there was nothing. His throat was dry, his tongue felt like a piece of sandpaper. He just squeezed his eyes shut, his hands still holding onto Buddy's fur, a final, desperate act of protection. He braced himself for the impact, for the first blow that was surely coming, and then a voice. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It was just a voice, calm and quiet, cutting through the thick, poisonous tension like a sharp, clean knife. "I think he asked you to leave him alone." The effect was instantaneous and electric. The growl in Rocco's throat cut off. The bikers who had been leaning in froze. Even the sound of the city seemed to pause for a beat. Every head on that corner turned. The people on the sidewalk who had been recording with their phones lowered them, their eyes wide with a new kind of curiosity. Arthur slowly opened his eyes, his heart still hammering, but now with a flicker of something else, confusion, hope. Leaning against the glass door of the diner, having just come out, was a man. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket over a plain t-shirt and worn-out jeans. He had a day's worth of stubble on his face, and his dark hair was a little messy. He looked like any other guy you might see on the streets of the city, unremarkable and anonymous. But his posture was relaxed, and his eyes were clear and steady. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't angry. He was just stating a simple, obvious fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. His gaze was fixed not on the whole group, but directly on Rocco. For a long moment, nobody moved. The scene was frozen in time, the terrified old man clutching his dog, the enraged biker looming over him, and the quiet stranger by the door holding them all in place with nothing more than his calm presence. It was Rocco who broke the spell. He slowly straightened up, turning his massive body to face the newcomer. The anger on his face was replaced by a look of sheer disbelief, which then morphed into a slow, wide smirk. He saw a man of average height, not particularly muscular. He saw no gang, no backup, no weapons. He saw just one guy, and to Rocco, one guy was not a threat. One guy was an opportunity. The other bikers relaxed, a ripple of low chuckles passing through them. The tension had broken, but it hadn't disappeared. It had just changed form. The danger was no longer a private moment of cruelty. It was now a public spectacle. Rocco took a step towards the man by the door, his heavy boot landing on the pavement with a thud that was meant to intimidate. His buddies fanned out, moving to flank the stranger, creating a semicircle of leather and ink, a human cage. They were enjoying this. The show had just gotten a whole lot better. Rocco looked the man up and down, a sneer playing on his lips. He was back in his element, the center of attention, the one in control. He puffed out his chest, the picture of arrogant confidence. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. He took another step closer, invading the man's personal space, trying to make him flinch. But the man didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, leaning against the door, his expression unchanged. His quiet stillness was a stark contrast to Rocco's loud, aggressive posturing. It was a battle of opposites, and for the first time that afternoon it wasn't clear who was winning. The question hung in the hot, heavy air, a challenge thrown from the top of a mountain. "And who are you supposed to be?" Rocco's voice was laced with contempt, a sound that was used to making people flinch, to making them shrink. His buddies, the wall of leather and muscle behind him, shifted their weight and cracked their knuckles, a chorus of low, threatening sounds. They were a pack and their leader had just cornered new prey. The crowd on the sidewalk, which had been a chaotic mix of indifference and pity, was now frozen in place. Phones, which had been casually recording, were now held steady, their lenses zoomed in on the unfolding drama. This was better than anything on television. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, the distant wail of a siren and the rumble of a passing truck fading into an irrelevant hum. The man in the simple jacket didn't answer right away. He didn't puff out his chest or square his shoulders. He didn't even look intimidated. He just stood there, his posture relaxed, leaning slightly against the diner's cool glass door. His calm was a weapon, a shield that Rocco's anger couldn't seem to penetrate. He let the silence stretch, letting Rocco's question dissolve into nothingness. Then he spoke, his voice clear and even, carrying easily across the short distance between them. "I'm someone who thinks you should pick on someone your own size." The words were simple, almost something a child might say on a playground. But coming from this man, in this situation, they had the weight of a judgment. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of principle, a quiet declaration that what was happening was wrong. Rocco's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected a fight or fear or a quick apology and a retreat. He hadn't expected this. This quiet, unshakable moral certainty was something he didn't know how to fight. It was like trying to punch smoke. A flicker of annoyance crossed Rocco's face. He took another step forward, closing the gap until he was just a foot away from the stranger. He wanted to see the fear in his eyes, to see him flinch. But the man's eyes remained steady, his gaze calm and focused. He wasn't looking at Rocco's gang or at the crowd or at the bikes. He was looking only at Rocco, as if he were the only other person in the world. This unnerved Rocco more than any glare could have. He could handle anger, but this quiet, focused attention was something else entirely. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Rocco snarled, his voice dropping to a low growl. He was trying to regain control of the situation, to pull the stranger into his world of aggression and dominance. "This isn't your business. This is between me and the old man." From his spot on the pavement, Arthur watched this exchange with a heart that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of his chest. He was terrified for this stranger, this man who had stepped into the line of fire on his behalf. A wave of guilt washed over him. This good man was in danger because of him, because of Buddy. He wanted to shout, to tell him to run, to just leave them to their fate. But his throat was tight, and no words would come out. He just held Buddy tighter, the dog's small body trembling against his own. Buddy, too, seemed to be watching the newcomer. His whining had stopped, and his head was cocked to one side. His ears perked up slightly, as if he too were trying to understand this strange, quiet man who wasn't afraid. The stranger ignored Rocco's question about being a hero. Instead, his gaze flickered for a moment towards Arthur and the dog, before returning to Rocco's angry face. "He's just a dog," the man said, his voice still impossibly calm. "And that's just an old man. There's no honor in what you're doing." Honor, the word hit Rocco like a physical blow. It was a word from a different world, a world he had long ago left behind. It was a word that spoke of respect and dignity, things he replaced with fear and intimidation a long time ago. The anger that had been simmering in his gut now boiled over. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. He felt the eyes of his crew on him, felt the judgment in this stranger's calm gaze. He was losing control of the narrative. He was the bully, not the tough guy. He had to do something to get it back. He lunged forward, stopping just inches from the man's face. He was so close that the man could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the anger on his breath. "You don't know anything about me." Rocco roared, the words exploding from him, a final, desperate attempt to assert his power. The spit from his mouth landed on the stranger's cheek, but the man didn't even wipe it away. He just stood there, a statue in the storm of Rocco's rage. This was the moment. The climax of the silent, screaming battle of wills. The crowd gasped. The bikers leaned forward, expecting the stranger to finally snap, to shove Rocco away, to do something. But he did none of that. Instead, something remarkable happened. The man's expression changed. The firm disapproval in his eyes softened, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. It was a look of pity, but not a pity that was condescending. It was a deep, empathetic pity that saw past the rage and the tattoos and the leather. "You're right," the man said quietly, his voice a stark contrast to Rocco's shout. "I don't—" The agreement was so disarming that it caught Rocco completely off guard. He had been ready for a fight, for an argument, for anything but this quiet concession. Then the man's gaze dropped from Rocco's face down to his thick, tattooed forearm. He stared at it for a long moment, as if reading a secret message written there. Rocco followed his gaze, confused, to a small, faded part of his tattoo sleeve, an old design that was almost completely covered by newer, darker ink. It was a small, winged dagger, a symbol from a life he had tried to forget. "That's a 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, isn't it?" the man asked, his voice barely a whisper now, a private question in the middle of a public standoff. He paused, then added, "My friend served with them." The effect of those simple words was instantaneous and catastrophic for Rocco, the entire structure of his anger. The whole persona he had built around himself as a tough, untouchable biker collapsed in an instant. It was like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and ashen. His lower lip began to tremble. The rage in his eyes was replaced by a wave of such raw, unfiltered pain that it was almost unbearable to witness. The tough guy was gone, and in his place was a lost, broken man. The whole street fell into a profound, stunned silence. The confrontation was over. It hadn't ended with a punch, but with a few quiet words that had hit harder and shattered more than any fist ever could. The silence that fell over the corner was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, thick silence, filled with the echoes of what had just happened. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down. Rocco, the mountain of a man who had been a volcano of rage just seconds before, was now perfectly still. His face, which had been flushed with anger, was now a pale, ashen gray. The sneer was gone, wiped clean as if it had never been there. In its place was a look of utter shock, of a man who had just seen a ghost. His friends, the pack of bikers who had been his loyal audience, now stood around looking confused and lost. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by furrowed brows and sideways glances at each other. They didn't know the rules for this situation. Their leader had been disarmed, not with a weapon, but with a few quiet words, and they had no idea what to do. The man in the simple jacket, the quiet stranger, didn't move. He didn't press his advantage. He didn't look triumphant. He just held Rocco's gaze, his expression soft, patient, as if he were waiting for an old friend to remember his name. This quiet patience was more powerful than any threat could have been. It gave Rocco the space to process the bomb that had just been dropped in his soul. Rocco's eyes, which had been hard and cruel, now looked glassy, unfocused. They were seeing something far beyond the hot pavement of the city street. He was seeing a different time, a different place. His gaze dropped to his own forearm, to the spot the stranger had indicated. He slowly, almost mechanically, raised his other hand and traced the outline of the faded tattoo with a thick, calloused finger. The winged dagger, a symbol of a brotherhood and a purpose he had buried under layers of new ink and even newer pain. It was a part of him he tried to forget, a part of him that hurt too much to remember. The crowd on the sidewalk felt the shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had been sharp and dangerous was now deep and sorrowful. People slowly lowered their phones, the urge to record a fight replaced by a more human instinct to witness a moment of profound vulnerability. The scene was no longer a spectacle. It was a confession. Finally, Rocco spoke. The voice that came out was not the booming, mocking growl from before. It was a choked, broken whisper, a sound that seemed to scrape its way up from a deep, dark place. "Yeah," he rasped, the single word barely audible. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. He looked back at the stranger, his eyes now filled with a desperate, pleading pain. Yeah. "It is." The stranger gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't say, "I knew it," or anything else that would sound like a victory. He just waited. He knew there was more. And there was The dam that had been holding back years of grief and trauma had a crack in it, and now it was bursting open. Rocco's massive shoulders began to shake. It started as a small tremor, but it grew into a deep, racking shudder. He looked away from the stranger, his eyes scanning the ground as if he were searching for something he had lost. His gaze fell upon Buddy, the small, scruffy dog who was the cause of all this trouble. And in that moment, something inside Rocco finally broke. I lost my dog over there, he choked out, the words thick with unshed tears. He couldn't look at anyone. He just stared at the pavement, his vision blurred. A military K-9, his name was Duke. He said the name as if it were both a prayer and a curse. He saved my life. The last words came out as a raw, ragged sob. The tough biker, the intimidating bully, was gone. In his place was a soldier, grieving the loss of his best friend. The revelation hit everyone like a physical wave. The cruelty wasn't random. It wasn't just malice for the sake of it. It was a twisted, agonized cry of pain from a man who had never learned how to heal. He had seen a reflection of his own lost companion in the old man's dog, and his response had been born from a place of such deep hurt that it had curdled into cruelty. Mocking the dog was a way of mocking his own weakness, his own unbearable loss. It was a desperate attempt to feel powerful in a world where he had once felt completely powerless from his spot on the ground. Arthur watched the transformation with a sense of awe and dawning understanding. The fear that had gripped him for so long began to melt away, replaced by a profound wave of empathy. He saw not a monster, but a fellow human being, broken and bleeding on the inside. He knew what that felt like. He tightened his grip on Buddy, but not out of fear anymore. It was a gesture of comfort, both for himself and for the dog who had been the unwitting catalyst for this moment of truth. Buddy, sensing the shift in the energy around him, stopped his trembling. He lifted his head and looked at Rocco, his dark eyes no longer filled with fear, but with a quiet, intelligent curiosity. The other bikers were completely deflated. Their leader, their symbol of strength, was falling apart in front of them. They looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of shame and helplessness. The skinny one with the greasy ponytail took a half step back, suddenly looking very young and very small. They had signed up for rides and rebellion, not for this raw, public display of grief. They were just boys playing at being tough men, and they were completely out of their depth. Rocco sank to his knees on the hot, dirty sidewalk. He didn't seem to care about the grime or the stares of the strangers. He was lost in a memory, a world of dust and danger and unwavering loyalty. He covered his face with his massive hands, and his whole body was racked with deep, gut-wrenching sobs. It was the sound of a man who had been strong for far too long. The tears carved clean paths through the dirt on his cheeks, washing away years of hardened indifference. The confrontation was over. The performance was finished. All that was left was the truth, and it was heartbreaking. The sound of Rocco's sobbing was the only thing that broke the heavy silence on the corner. It was a raw, painful sound, the kind of noise a man makes when he's finally letting go of a weight he's carried for far too long. It echoed off the brick walls of the diner, a stark contrast to the aggressive roar of his motorcycle just minutes before. The entire world seemed to have stopped to watch this giant of a man fall apart. The people on the sidewalk didn't see a bully anymore. They saw a human being, broken and laid bare. The phones that had been recording a potential fight were now lowered, held loosely in hands that had forgotten their purpose. The morbid curiosity had been replaced by a quiet, collective sense of empathy. Even the city's noise seemed to respect the moment, holding a respectful distance. Rocco's buddies, the pack of bikers who had fed off his aggression, were now like lost puppies. They stood around in a loose, awkward circle, their leather jackets suddenly looking like costumes. They didn't know where to look or what to do. Their leader, the man they followed, was on his knees, weeping on a dirty sidewalk. One of them, a young kid with a fresh tattoo of a skull on his neck, started to say something, then thought better of it, shutting his mouth with an audible click. They were out of their depth, navigating a sea of emotion they had no training for. From his spot on the pavement, Arthur felt a profound shift inside himself. The fear that had been his constant companion for the last 10 minutes had vanished completely. In its place was a deep, aching sense of compassion. He looked at the heaving shoulders of the man who had terrified him, and he didn't see a monster. He saw a man drowning in a memory. He understood that kind of pain. He held Buddy a little tighter, but the gesture was no longer about protection from the outside world. It was about sharing a moment of quiet comfort, a silent acknowledgement that they were both witnessing something deeply human. Slowly, as if the storm of his grief was passing, Rocco's sobs began to quiet. They turned into shuddering breaths, then into hiccups. He slowly lowered his hands from his face, revealing a mess of tears and grime. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and for the first time they looked soft, vulnerable. He stared at the ground, at the cracks in the pavement, as if he were ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. Then his eyes lifted and they fell upon Buddy. The dog was still sitting on Arthur's lap, his head cocked, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. There was no fear in the dog's eyes anymore, just a calm, steady observation. Rocco looked at this small, scruffy creature, the very thing that had triggered this avalanche of emotion, and something in his expression changed. It was a look of recognition, of seeing not a mangy mutt, but a friend, a companion. A memory of Duke. With a slowness that was almost painful to watch, Rocco began to move. He shifted his weight from his heels to his knees, his movements stiff and uncertain. He extended a hand, the same hand that had been clenched in a fist just moments before. But now it was open. The fingers, which had been curled in anger, were relaxed, trembling slightly. He held the hand out, not snapping his fingers or making a sound, just offering it in the air between them. It was a question, not a command. Buddy, seeming to understand the language of this new gesture, leaned forward. He sniffed Rocco's fingertips cautiously, his little nose twitching. Then he gave the hand a gentle lick with his warm, wet tongue. It was a simple act of acceptance, a pardon that cost nothing but meant everything. A fresh wave of tears welled in Rocco's eyes, but these were different. They were not tears of pain, but of release. He gently, so gently, stroked the top of Buddy's head, his rough fingers moving softly through the dog's scruffy fur. The contrast was breathtaking. The hand that had threatened violence was now offering a tender, healing touch. It was in this moment, watching this giant man interact so gently with his small dog, that Arthur felt a connection form. He saw past the tattoos and the leather and the intimidating size. He saw a fellow soldier. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet. Rocco looked up, his eyes questioning, expecting judgment or scorn. But Arthur just gave a small, sad smile. He tapped a worn, faded patch on the side of his tattered backpack, a patch most people never noticed. It was the flag of his unit, the colors faded by sun and rain. "First Cavalry," Arthur said, his voice soft but clear. "Afghanistan." The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of shared experience. Rocco stared at the patch, then back at Arthur's face. The understanding that passed between them was a tangible thing. It was a bond forged in a place no one else could truly understand. Rocco wasn't just a biker who had lost a dog. He was a veteran who had lost his brother in arms. And Arthur wasn't just a homeless man with a pet. He was a soldier who had also carried that weight home. They were from different units, different battles, but they were part of the same tribe. The quiet stranger who had started it all had been watching from the doorway of the diner. He had seen the entire transformation, from cruelty to confession to connection. He knew his part was over. Without a word, he turned and pushed open the door to the diner, the little bell above it jingling softly. He walked up to the counter where the manager was watching the scene outside with wide eyes. The stranger spoke to him in a low voice, gesturing towards the door. The manager, a portly man with a kind face, nodded quickly, a look of understanding on his face. The stranger pulled out his wallet, paid for the order, and then walked back outside. He didn't make a big show of his return. He just walked back to the small group on the sidewalk. "I've got lunch covered for everyone," he said simply, his voice calm and gentle. He looked at the awkward bikers, at the small crowd, and then his gaze settled on the two men and the dog at the center of it all. He placed a hand briefly on Rocco's shoulder, a firm, warm pressure that was both a comfort and a final, quiet blessing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't look back. He just stuffed his hands in his pockets and disappeared down the street, becoming just another anonymous face in the flow of the city. As if he had never been there at all, the diner door opened again, and a young waitress came out carrying a tray loaded with burgers, fries, and sodas. She looked a little nervous, but she walked over to the group and began handing out the food. The bikers took theirs hesitantly, their tough guy act completely gone. They found spots on the curb and began to eat in silence. But the real focus was on the corner. Rocco was still on his knees, but now he was sharing a plate of fries with Arthur, breaking them in half and offering a piece to Buddy, who nibbled it gently from his fingers. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting a long, warm shadow over the scene. The confrontation was over, the performance finished. All that was left was the quiet, unexpected beginning of a friendship, born from a moment of cruelty, healed by a moment of courage, and sealed by the quiet grace of a stranger.